The wind across the high plains of the New Mexico territory was a knife made of glass. It cut without warning and left a chill that went deeper than bone into the marrow of memory itself. Silas knew this wind. He had been born in it, had fled from it, and had now returned to it, a ghost haunting the edges of a life he'd failed to live. His cabin was a solitary tooth against the gumline of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, a place to measure the slow bleed of days into years. He was checking his trap lines along the half-frozen ribbon of Coyote Creek when he saw it. Not the clean tracks of a wolf or the delicate print of a deer, but a smear. A long, ugly brushstroke of crimson against the brittle, frost-white snow. It led from the sparse timberline down toward the water, a desperate crawl. Silas's hand went to the butt of the Colt Peacemaker, holstered at his hip, a gesture as natural and unconscious as breathing. Every instinct, honed by years of solitude and the whispers of a past he couldn't outrun, screamed at him to turn back. Nothing good ever began with another man's blood. Especially not here. This land was a patchwork of treaties broken before the ink was dry, of ghosts with claims far older than any government deed. But the stain was small, too small for a man. And it wavered, as if the will behind it was guttering like a cheap candle. He followed, his boots crunching a rhythm of reluctance on the snow. The trail ended at a shallow overhang, a hollow in the creek bank shielded by the gnarled roots of a cottonwood. There, curled into a space that seemed too small to hold a life, was a body, an Apache girl. She couldn't have been more than 12 or 13 winters old. Her doeskin dress was torn and dark with frozen blood that stemmed from a ragged wound. In her side, a wound that looked suspiciously like a graze from a rifle ball. But what held his gaze, what made the air leave his lungs in a painful rush, was what she was wrapped in. A Union cavalry jacket, faded blue, buttons missing but unmistakable. The very coat of the life he had deserted. Her face was turned away. From him, her black hair matted with ice and dirt. Her breathing was a shallow, wet rattle. She was dying. He knew it with the certainty of a man who had seen death in all its vulgar guises. He should leave her. To interfere was to invite a reckoning that did not distinguish between intent and action. The people, her people, would not see a rescue. They would see a theft, a final violation. He stood there for a long time, the wind whipping his hair across his weathered face. He looked up at the vast indifferent sky, a canvas of bruised purple and pale gray. He saw the jagged peaks that had watched empires rise and fall, that had seen the Spanish come with their crosses and the Americans with their steel rails, and had remained unchanged. He felt his own insignificance, the pathetic smallness of his own remorse. What was one more sin of omission on a soul already so heavily mortgaged? He knelt, the snow soaked through the knee of his canvas trousers. He reached out a hand, his fingers calloused and scarred. He hesitated, then gently brushed the hair from her face. Her skin was fever-hot to his ice-cold touch. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and deep and fathomless, like chips of obsidian. They held no fear, only a kind of ancient weariness. She looked at him, and her lips parted, releasing a single guttural word. A name, he thought, not a plea. A statement. It was a sound not meant for his ears, a name that felt like a key turning in a lock deep inside him. Then her eyes rolled back into her head, and the shallow breathing stopped. For a moment, he thought she was gone. But then, a shudder, a tiny fragile gasp, a fight. Silas looked down at his hands, at the tremor he could never quite control. He had spent 10 years trying to wash the blood of her people off them. 10 years of running, of building a fortress of solitude, to keep the ghosts at bay. And now, the land itself had brought a ghost to his door, wrapped in the uniform of his shame. He made a choice. Or maybe the choice was made for him by the hawk that suddenly screamed from the heights above, its cry a sharp, piercing judgment that echoed off the canyon walls and settled into the unnerving silence that followed. He slid his arms beneath her, the cavalry coat rough against his skin, and lifted her from her frozen cradle. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of broken twigs and fading warmth. As he rose, the weight in his arms felt less like a child and more like a verdict. He carried her back across the plains, his own blood leaving a new set of tracks beside hers, a story of two wounds heading for a single desolate shelter. The cabin was a testament to a man trying to erase himself. The walls were bare pine, scrubbed clean. The furniture was hewn by his own hand, functional and stark. A single bed, a table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth that was the cabin's only source of warmth and light. It smelled of wood smoke, pine resin, and loneliness. He laid her on his bed, the only soft place in the entire structure. The cavalry jacket felt like a living accusatory thing as he unbuttoned it. He pulled it away from her body and saw the wound more clearly. It was a deep gouge along her ribs. Not a direct hit, but a ricochet or a shot from a spent round. It was dirty already, showing the angry red edges of infection. He worked with a grim, practiced efficiency that belonged to another life. He stoked the fire until it blazed, casting dancing shadows that made the small room seem vast and haunted. He boiled water, sterilizing his skinning knife in the flames. He tore strips from his own cleanest shirt. As he worked, the memories came unbidden, not in a flood, but in shards. The smell of black powder and panicked horses. The high, keening wail of a woman as her world ended. The face of Captain Morrow, his eyes alight with a righteous fire as he gave the order. No quarter. Cleanse the valley. Silas had been 20 years old, his own face smooth and unlined, his soul not yet scarred. He remembered the weight of the Springfield rifle in his hands, the sickness that rose in his throat. He remembered lowering the barrel, pointing it at the sky and firing, the recoil a hollow punch against his shoulder. An act of defiance so small it was almost invisible. Lost in the cacophony of slaughter, but it had been enough. It had bought him a discharge for cowardice and a decade of self-imposed exile. Now under his hands was the consequence of that world. The girl on his bed was not an abstraction. She was the flesh and blood of the ghosts that rode with him in his dreams. He cleaned the wound, his touch surprisingly gentle. She was unconscious, or perhaps had retreated to a place in her mind where he could not follow. Her skin was etched with faint, delicate scars on her forearms, ritualistic and precise. Marks of passage, of identity. He felt like a trespasser, a clumsy brute touching something sacred. He found the bullet, a flattened piece of lead lodged against a rib. He worked it free with the tip of his knife, the soft grating of metal on bone sending a shudder through him. He dropped the lead onto the hearthstone with a soft clink. It was the same caliber as the rifles his unit had carried. He stitched. The wound closed with a needle and thread meant for mending canvas, his stitches coarse but strong. He ground herbs into a poultice yarrow to stop the bleeding willow bark for the fever skills learned not from the army, but from a woman named Elspeth he had known before the war, a woman whose memory was now just another ghost in the crowded room of his past. He packed the poultice against the wound and bound her ribs tightly with the clean strips of his shirt. For 2 days she drifted in the fever's gray twilight. Silas sat by the bed, keeping the fire lit, forcing sips of cool water between her cracked lips. The silence in the cabin was a living thing, broken only by her shallow breathing and the roar of the wind outside. He did not sleep. He watched, and in the flickering firelight, he saw her. She was not just a girl. She was a vessel of memory. When the fire flared, her eyelids would twitch, as if she were seeing not the gentle flames in his hearth, but the consuming fire that had taken her family, her village. She would sometimes murmur in her own tongue, the words soft and liquid, full of sorrow. He didn't understand them, but he understood the cadence of loss. He and the girl were 2 ghosts under one roof, their wounds different, but their silence the same. His was the silence of shame. Hers was the silence of trauma. In the quiet of the cabin, their silences clashed, a deafening, invisible war. He looked at the hard line of his jaw in the reflection of the cabin's single window and saw not a rescuer, but a jailer. He had not saved her. He had only postponed her fate, and in doing so, had trapped her with the very thing she was fleeing, a white man with blood on his hands. On the third morning, the fever broke. He awoke from a shallow, dream-haunted doze in his chair to find her eyes open. They were clear, lucid, and fixed on him. There was no gratitude in them, no fear, just a deep, unnerving stillness, a watchfulness that stripped him bare. He offered her a bowl of thin broth. She sat up slowly, wincing, and took it from him. Her hands were steady. She drank, her eyes never leaving his. When she was finished, she handed the empty bowl back to him. She did not speak, not a word. He took the cavalry jacket outside. He dug a hole in the frozen earth behind the cabin, a task that took him over an hour of chipping away at the iron-hard ground. He folded the coat carefully, as if performing a burial rite, and placed it in the hole. He covered it with dirt and rocks, a final futile attempt to bury his own past. When he returned to the cabin, she was sitting up, staring at the hearth. But she was not looking at the fire. She was looking at the ash that had spilled onto the stone. Slowly, she reached out a slender finger and began to draw in the gray dust. Not pictures of horses or trees. She drew patterns, symbols, a spiral, then a series of interconnected lines, a map of something he could not comprehend. It was a language written in the residue of destruction. The days that followed fell into a strange, dreamlike rhythm, a quiet before a storm he knew was gathering. Just over the horizon, he would hunt, leaving her alone for hours, and when he returned, she would be exactly where he had left her, sitting by the fire, her silence a heavy blanket over the small room. He would cook, they would eat, their gazes meeting over the rough-hewn table, 1,000 words passing between them without a single one being spoken. He found himself talking to her, or rather, to the silence she occupied. He told her about the mountains, about the way the light changed at dusk. He hummed the old folk songs Elspeth had taught him, his voice raspy from disuse. He was not trying to comfort her. He was trying to fill the terrifying void she carried within her, a void that mirrored his own. One evening, as the shadows grew long and the world outside turned a deep, bruised blue, she began to hum. It was not one of his melodies. It was a low, ancient-sounding chant, a song that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It was hauntingly beautiful and deeply unsettling. He stopped his own tuneless humming and listened. The melody rose and fell, a thread of sound weaving through the silence. He felt a chill crawl up his spine. She was not humming for him. She was not humming for herself. He felt it then, a presence, a watchfulness that was not his own. The hair on his arms stood on end. He looked to the window, but saw only his own reflection staring back from the black glass. The song was not for someone inside the cabin. It was for someone outside, someone listening from the darkness, from the patient, waiting land. The quiet was over. The storm was here. The dawn came not with light, but with an absence of sound. The ceaseless wind had died. The creaking of the cabin's timbers fell silent. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath, the flames burning low and steady without their usual flicker and pop. It was a silence so profound, so absolute, that it woke Silas from his chair. He rose, every nerve ending tingling with a primal dread. He moved to the window and wiped the condensation from the pane. At first, he saw nothing but the gray, pre-dawn fog that had crept down from the mountains, a thick, rolling shroud that swallowed the landscape. Then, a shape emerged from the mist. A single rider on a pinto horse, sitting perfectly still about 100 yards from the cabin. He was a silhouette, a statue carved from the fog itself. He carried no rifle, only a long, feather-adorned lance held upright. He did not move, he just watched. Silas's heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. He felt the girl's presence behind him. She had risen from the bed and stood near the hearth, her small frame rigid. She too was watching the rider. Then another shape materialized from the fog. And another, and another. They did not ride forward. They simply appeared, fanning out in a silent, perfectly spaced arc. 10, 20, 30 riders. All as still as the first, their faces unreadable, their presence a crushing weight. They were not a war party. They were a tribunal. The fog swirled, and a space opened in the center of their line. Through it, a man walked. He was older, his face a magnificent ruin of lines and creases, each one telling a story of hardship and endurance. He wore no chief's headdress, only a simple buckskin shirt and leggings. His authority was not in his adornment, but in the way he moved, the way the very earth seemed to accept his tread. At his side, his hand resting on the shoulder of a boy of about 10, was the man who could only be their leader. The chief, Nakia. The voice. He walked until he was just beyond the range of a thrown stone from the cabin door, the boy a step behind him. The riders remained where they were, a silent, unblinking jury of ghosts and fog. The land itself had gone quiet. The birds were silent. The insects were still. Every heartbeat in Silas's chest felt like a thunderclap. He could feel the accumulated history of this place, the centuries of pain and pride and broken promises, all focused on the single point of his cabin door. He looked at the girl. Her face was calm, her expression one of solemn finality. She knew these men. She had been waiting for them. Her humming had been a summons. Silas knew what he had to do. There was no defense to offer, no explanation that would suffice. He had crossed a line that was not his to cross. He had touched what was not his to touch. He opened the cabin door. The cold morning air hit him like a physical blow. He stepped out onto the porch, his hands held open at his sides, empty. He did not look at the riders. He looked only at the chief. Nakia's eyes, dark and piercing, met his. They held the weight of generations. They held the memory of every treaty, every massacre, every lie. For a long moment, there was only the sound of Silas's own breathing. Then the chief spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the unnatural stillness with the clarity of a bell. The words were English, spoken with a deliberation that gave each one the weight of a stone. It touched one of ours. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a judgment. The final damning piece of evidence. Silas felt the strength go out of his legs. But it was not fear that buckled his knees. It was the crushing weight of a shame too heavy to bear standing up. He dropped to one knee in the snow before his own cabin, his head bowed. Not in supplication, not in terror, but in atonement. He had no right to stand before this man. He had no right to breathe the air his people had breathed for 1,000 years. He knelt in the shadow of his own history and waited for the sentence to be carried out. They did not kill him. They did not bind him. The reckoning they delivered was quieter and far more profound. Nakia gestured with his chin, a small sharp movement. Two of the riders dismounted and walked toward Silas. He did not resist as they flanked him. They did not touch him, but their presence was as binding as any rope. Nakia turned and began the walk back toward the fog from which he had emerged. The riders turned their horses, opening a path. The message was clear. Silas was to come. With them, he glanced back at the cabin. The girl, Ishkene, stood in the doorway watching him. Her expression was unreadable. He turned and followed the chief, the two warriors walking the pace behind him. He was swallowed by the mist and the silent company of the Apache. The journey was less than a mile, to a hidden encampment in a shallow, wooded canyon he had never known existed, so close to his own place of exile. It was not a war camp, but a winter village. The lodges or wickiups were fashioned from bent branches and hides, blending seamlessly with the landscape. The smell of cedar smoke hung in the air. Women stopped their work to watch him pass there, faces stern and impassive. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, their dark eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and fear. They led him to the center of the camp, to a large, ceremonial fire that had already been lit. He was told to sit. He sat on the frozen ground, the two warriors taking up positions behind him. He was a prisoner in a camp that did not need walls. For hours he sat in silence as the life of the village unfolded around him. He saw a world he had only ever known. As an enemy, a target. He saw mothers teaching their daughters to bead, old men telling stories to the young boys, hunters returning with deer slung over their horses. He saw a community, a people, a life that persisted despite everything his own kind had done to extinguish it. The shame in his gut twisted into a knot of profound self-loathing. As the sun reached its zenith, Nakia approached, followed by an old woman whose face was a beautiful map of wrinkles. She was the tribe's memory keeper, he sensed. The chief sat opposite Silas, the fire between them. "The girl's name is Ishgene," Nakia said, his voice low. "She who remembers." "An appropriate name. She remembers you." Silas's blood ran cold. I have never seen her before that day at the creek." "Her memory is longer than her life," the old woman said, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "It is carried in the blood." She began to speak in her own tongue, her words a rhythmic, poetic narrative. Nakia translated, his own voice devoid of emotion, a mere conduit for the story. The story was of a day 10 years ago. Of a raid on a small, peaceful encampment in the Cimarron Valley. Of blue-coated soldiers who came with fire and rifles. They spoke of a sub-chief named Soe, the Eagle, who fought to defend the women and children. They spoke of how he was cut down. And they spoke of how, in the chaos, Sohei's wife pushed their small daughter into a thicket of scrub oak, telling her to run and not look back. The soldiers were killing everyone, Nakia translated, his eyes boring into Silas. The Captain Morrow gave the order, no quarter. But one soldier, a young one with a face of fear and sickness, did not fire on the women who ran. He raised his rifle to the sky. The moment of his hesitation, the sound of his single wasted shot, drew the attention of another soldier. The confusion was enough. One child, hidden in the bushes, was able to slip away into the chaos. Silas felt the air leave his lungs. He remembered, God, he remembered it all. The face of the woman pushing her child away. The flash of his own rifle pointed at the uncaring sky. The feeling of utter futility. The child who escaped, Nakiyan continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, was Ish-K-Nay. She is the daughter of Soe, whom our eyes saw your Captain Morrow kill. She is the last of his bloodline. The first shocking twist landed on Silas not like a blow, but like a shroud. He hadn't just saved a random Apache girl. He had, in his one pathetic act of defiance a decade ago, created the very possibility of her survival. His shame and her life were inextricably linked. He had not rescued her at the creek. He had only completed a rescue he had unknowingly begun. 10 years prior. She was found by another band days later, Nakia said. She was with other survivors who had been on a hunt, and she carried a story, a vision. She said she saw the soldier who did not shoot her. She said his face was marked not by hate, but by a ghost of his own making. She said one day he would stand between her and death again, not with a gun, but with his hands. This was the second twist, a turn so sharp it left him breathless. She was not just a child. She was a seer, a prophet of her own survival. She had not been humming a song of mourning in his cabin. She had been humming a song of recognition. When a hunting party found her tracks near the creek, they also found yours, Nakia said. They saw you carry her away. They followed. They watched your cabin. They saw you tend her wound. They saw you bury the soldier coat, the very symbol of her people's destruction. And they heard her sing the song of the prophecy, the song of the man marked by a ghost. Silas looked down at his hands. He finally understood. They had not come for retribution. They had come for confirmation. They had come because their child, their seer, had told them a story 10 years ago, and he had just, unwittingly, played his part. He looked up at Nakia, the firelight flickering in the chief's ancient eyes. There was nothing left to say. The story was told. The circle was complete. He was not her savior. He was merely a tool of her vision, a piece of a pattern woven. Long before he had stumbled upon her by the creek, he finally spoke, his voice hoarse. What you want of me, I will give. What you ask of me, I will do. My life is forfeit. It has been for a long time. He was not begging for his life. He was begging for a purpose for his death. Nakia simply stared at him, his expression unreadable. We do not want your death. The white man gives death freely. It is worth nothing to us. We ask for something you did not know you carried. The chief rose. The reckoning was not over. It was just beginning. As twilight bled across the sky, painting the canyon in hues of orange and deep violet, a fire was lit in the center of the village. Not the communal fire where Silas had sat, but a larger, more intense blaze. Its flames leaped high into the cooling air, casting wild, dancing shadows against the wickiups and the stony canyon walls. Then, the drums began. It was not the frantic, chaotic beat Silas had heard in his nightmares of battle. This was a slow, deep, resonant pulse. The heartbeat of the earth itself. It was a sound that vibrated not in the ears, but in the chest, in the bones. One by one, the people of the village emerged from their homes and formed a wide, silent circle around the fire. Silas was led from his place of waiting and brought to the edge of the circle. He stood between the same two warriors, a silent observer to a ritual he could not comprehend. He saw Ishkene step out from beside Nakia. She was no longer wearing the tattered doeskin dress. She was adorned in a beautiful newly made white buckskin dress, intricately decorated with beads and porcupine quills. Her hair was combed and braided with eagle feathers. She looked like a princess or a bride or a sacrifice. The thought hit Silas with the force of a physical blow, a funeral, a purification rite. They were going to commit her to the flames, to send her spirit to join her father's, a cleansing of the taint of his touch, of the world of the white man. His mind screamed, no, after all this. After her survival, her vision, it couldn't end like this. As she began to walk slowly, reverently, toward the roaring fire, something inside Silas snapped. The years of passivity, of accepting his fate, of wallowing in his shame, it all burned away in a sudden fierce blaze of protective instinct. He lunged forward, shoving aside the warrior to his right. Stop, he yelled, his voice raw. Don't, take me instead. It was my fault. She is innocent, take me. He expected to be struck down, to be pierced by a dozen arrows or spears. But the second warrior simply put a firm, unyielding hand on his chest, stopping his advance. Nakia turned his head slowly, his expression not of anger, but of something else. Something akin to understanding. This is not a death rite, Silas, the chief said, using his name for the first time. His voice was calm, cutting through the drumming and Silas's own panicked breathing. This is a naming. Silas froze, his mind struggling to grasp. The words, a naming? Ishkene did not walk into the fire. She stopped before it, her small face illuminated by the golden light. She turned to face the assembled tribe. The old woman, the memory keeper, stepped forward and began to chant, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the drums. She told the story again, for all to hear. The story of the raid, of the lost child, of the vision, of the man with the ghost on his soul who fulfilled the prophecy. When she was finished, an absolute silence fell over the canyon. The drums stopped. The only sound was the crackle and hiss of the great fire. Nakia walked to stand beside Ish-K-Nay. He looked directly at Silas. "You carry the ghost of the man you were," Nakia declared, his voice ringing with authority, "the soldier who killed our people. But you also carry the seed of the man you have become. The one who refused an order, the one who tended a wound, the one who offered his life for hers." He beckoned Silas forward. The warrior removed his hand from Silas's chest. Numbly, hesitantly, Silas walked into the circle, the heat of the fire warm on his face. He stopped before the chief and the girl. "A man with two souls cannot have one name," Nakia said. "We cannot call you by the name the white men gave you, for that is the name of a ghost. We will give you a new name, a name to bind the two souls together, a name that carries a burden and a purpose." Ish-K-Nay stepped forward. She was so small, yet she radiated a power that humbled him. She reached up a small, steady hand. Silas flinched, expecting a blow, a mark, a final judgment. Instead, she gently placed her hand on his bowed head. It was the single most profound moment of irrational mercy he had ever known. It was forgiveness. It was acceptance. It was a bond. In that one silent touch, the world held its breath. The weight of his past didn't vanish, but it shifted. It was no longer just a source of shame, but the foundation of this sacred, terrifying moment. Nakia spoke the name, the words rolling out like stones forming a new path. "We name you he who carries the silence, for you brought not the noise of guns and cannons, but the quiet of healing. You did not speak of righteousness, but you acted with a silent heart. This is your name, this is your burden. You will carry the silence of our pain and the silence of your atonement. You will live among us, a bridge between the world that is and the world that was. You are no longer Silas, you are of the people now." They were not giving him her hand in marriage, as a lesser man might have fantasized. They were giving him something far more sacred and far more binding. They were giving him a place, a responsibility. They were rewriting his soul. He looked at Ish-K-Nay, at the ancient wisdom in her young eyes, and knew he was not being honored. He was being claimed. He was being remade in the crucible of their fire and their forgiveness. The man known as Silas died in that moment, and a new man, a man with a purpose forged in fire and silence, was born. He stayed. There was no other path. To leave would be to break the most sacred vow he had ever made, a vow made not with words, but with a touch and a name. He did not vanish back into the white world. He vanished into the world of the Apache, a far more complete and total disappearance. He did not become a warrior. He had no stomach left for fighting. He did not become a hunter. His skills were clumsy compared to theirs. He took on the role he had been given. He became a guardian, a bridge. He learned their language, not from lessons, but from listening. He learned their ways, not from instruction, but from observation. He learned to read the land not as a resource to be tamed, but as a living text, full of stories and warnings. He became the quiet man who sat with the elders, who listened to their stories of the before times. He became the one who taught the children the strange, sad songs from his own past, songs of a lost love named Elspeth, which to them were just melodies from a ghost world. He was a keeper of a past they needed to understand, just as they were. The keepers of a future he needed to serve. Ish-K-Nay grew from a girl into a woman, her seer's sight deepening with the years. She never spoke to him of the vision again, but there was an unbreakable bond between them, a debt and a payment that flowed both ways. He was her living, breathing history, and she was his absolution. Years passed. The world outside the canyon changed. More blue-coated soldiers came, then ranchers with their barbed wire, then government men with their papers and their promises of reservation life, which was a slow death in a different guise. He who carries the silence stood with Nakia, his pale skin and blue eyes a strange anomaly in the council of Apache leaders. He spoke to the white men in their own tongue, translating not just their words, but their intentions, their deceptions, their hollow hearts. He used the language of his old life to protect his new one. He never fired a gun again. But he stood, a silent, immovable presence, between the people and the world that sought to erase them. His life became a long, continuous act of standing in the way. He grew old. His hair turned the color of the winter snow on the peaks. His face became as lined and weathered as Nakia's had been. He died not in a battle, not by a bullet or a knife, but in his sleep, in a wickiup that smelled of cedar and sage, surrounded by the grandchildren of the boy who had stood beside the chief on that foggy morning. They buried him in the Apache way, on a high ledge overlooking the canyon that had been his sanctuary and his life's work. Ishkene, now a revered elder, the new memory keeper of her tribe, stood over his grave. She did not weep. She spoke to the fire they had lit for his spirit journey, her voice clear and strong in the cold mountain air, ensuring his story would be woven into the fabric of the people forever. On the canyon wall, below his final resting place, a young warrior carved a pictograph. It showed a man kneeling and a small girl placing a hand upon his head. Beneath it, he wrote nothing. The story was not for outsiders. It was for them. A whisper to the fire, a secret held by the land itself. The final, true accounting of the man they had remade. A truth more lasting than any name carved on a white man's tombstone. He gave what the others never did, time and blood and silence.